ومن المنافسين بعلومهم وبثقافاتهم وبأبحاثهم على المستوى الدولي. نستضيف اليوم مفكر في مجال الاقتصاد وفائز بجائزة نوبل، وأتمنى أن في يوم ما في هذا المعرض نستضيف فائز من دولة الإمارات ومن هذه المنطقة بجائزة نوبل في الاقتصاد. اسمحوا لي أتحدث باللغة الإنجليزية. Professor Jeido, we are grateful for your presence today. You have won the Nobel Prize in a year filled with challenges. We have survived COVID-19. We have survived many challenges for the past 2 years, and I think the way communities live and the way economy is shaping is way different today than it was in 2021 and in 2020. I've watched a video where you have a chat with your kids about the work you have done when it comes to data science and the way you look at data. And I loved how you simplified your work, your years of work in a very short video. I'd love if we can start with that question. What do you work on and how can we simplify it to our day-to-day life?
Can you translate it for those who cannot speak English? Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. So is this working? Thanks for inviting me here. It's been a great pleasure being here. And so let me actually start with a short story. When I was an undergraduate in the Netherlands about 35 years ago, at some point I was taking a class in macroeconomics. And so we were studying these really complicated models, kind of where you could use the cash to buy goods or bonds, and the government could invest money, they could change taxes, they could change interest rates. And kind of we studied this for the whole semester, and at the end of the semester I realized something. I actually had no idea what bonds were. I had no idea what that really was about. And so I knew what cash was. I had some cash. I knew what goods were. I could go to the store and buy a loaf of bread or a bar of chocolate, but I had no idea what bonds were. And they'd never explained it to me. And I'd never really asked. And if you think that was bad, actually it turned out that none of my classmates knew what bonds were either. And so that class taught me something that was actually more important than anything else I learned as an undergraduate. To do any of these things well, you need to always remind yourself of what you don't know. And you need to be willing to acknowledge what you don't know. And you need to ask the right questions. So if I'm saying something here that people don't understand, please ask questions. Because the most important thing is to ask questions, and because that's the only way you're going to learn some of these things. So the question was about causality. What does it really mean? What do we really think about that? And probably if there's anything people knew before coming to this talk, it's probably that correlation is not the same as causation. And there's lots of examples of that. There's lots of examples where we see a correlation that we don't think is causal. Every morning, we have chickens at home. And every morning the rooster crows, and then the sun comes up. But much as the rooster might think otherwise, it's not the rooster causing the sun to come up. And another common example is that there's a positive correlation between shark attacks and ice cream sales. But again, that's not causal. It's just that in the summer, people are more likely to buy ice cream, and they're more likely to go swimming in the sea. So what I've been trying to do in my career is trying to figure out how to disentangle cause and effect, how to extract causal effects from simple correlations. And kind of before I go any further, I should also mention that if you email anything about this talk, make sure that you spell it right, that it's causal and not casual. When National Public Radio last year told their listeners about the Nobel Prize, they said that Angus and I had won for our work on casual relationships, and our wives were very surprised by that. But so what do I really do? What we're trying to do is trying to see how we can learn about causal effects even if we don't do experiments. If we can do experiments, that's great. Then that really allows us to very clearly learn about causal effects. And for example, the Food and Drug Administration insists in the US on drugs, in the drug approval process, that we do experiments. But in economics and in social science, we often can't do that. We can't, if you're interested in learning about the effect of going to college, how important that is, we can't simply do an experiment where we say, you guys go to college and you guys do something else, but you're not allowed to go to college. That wouldn't really be fair. So we need to figure out other things. And that's kind of where the work I do comes in. We're trying to find ways where nature has done some experiment for us and where we can figure out what the causal effects are indirectly through cleverly analyzing the data.
Professor, so just for me to digest what you have mentioned currently. So the causal effect is basically when you don't have the luxury to do actual scientific experiment in an area, you do the experiment using the organic data that is there and exists at the society. So for example, just if that example works, when it comes to chemistry, pharmacy, we can have an open lab where we can do our own experiments. But if we went into people's education, people's health, people's income, it's very risky to come and get 20, 30, 40 people in a room and do experiments with it because you don't have the luxury to do so. You would need the data that exists on our day-to-day life and analyze it using this method.
Exactly. That's exactly. That's exactly right. So what we are trying to do is exploit the fact that there's some variation that we see in the data that can help us extract the causal effects from the correlations. And so, for example, if we're interested in the effect of education on income, clearly people make choices there. People don't just randomly go to college or not. But there's some systematic variation that we can exploit. And in the US, for example, compulsory schooling laws generate some variation in how much schooling people get. But these compulsory schooling laws kind of just varied somewhat randomly between states and how they affected people, depending on when you were born during the year. So for example, compulsory schooling laws may say that you need to go to school in the year you turn 5 as measured on October 1st. But that means that children born on September 30th are treated very differently from children born on October 1st. And that may show up in slightly different education levels, and that might help you extract the effect of education on earnings. So yeah, so you can do these things in many cases. And so, for example, one thing that often happens is that there's rules in educational settings, that there's rules that have very sharp cutoff points. People may need to do a test to see if they get promoted to the next year or get held back for a year. And it may be that you need to score 50 or more on the test to get promoted. But clearly the children who score just below 50 are likely to be very similar to the children who score just above 50. And so we can use it again there to figure out what the effect of promoting these kids or of holding them back is. And so in the end, there are many examples, there are many cases where nature essentially does these experiments for us, and where we don't have to do a regular clinical randomized experiment of the type to do in medicine, but we can still extract credible causal effects from the data.
Professor, I have looked at your study. You have studied lottery winners in a way that turned out to be a model of economy and how it affects the behaviors of those winners. بروفيسور درس مجموعة من الفائزين بالسحوبات واليا نصيب وشاف أثر هذه الجوائز على سلوكياتهم الاقتصادية وعلى حياتهم خلال السنوات اللي مضت. We would love if we can hear more about that study and your conclusion and your...
So in that study, we were at some level interested in what the effect would be of having a universal basic income. And that's, of course, an idea that's been around a long time. It came up again in the 2020 presidential election in the US, where Andrew Yang has expressed support for a universal basic income. But it goes back a long way. Thomas Paine was in favor of it. Martin Luther King was a strong advocate for a universal basic income. But the question always is, if you give people a basic income, if you give people a check every week without them having to work for it, would they still show up for work? Would they still have reasons to go look for work? And so figuring out what would happen isn't so easy. One thing that economists had done was look at people who got inheritances. But that's not quite the same as an experiment, because people would be coming from rich families, and they might be different in other ways. Sometimes people have looked at spousal income, and again, that doesn't depend on how much I work, but it's again not random. And so what we did in this study was look at people who played the lottery. Of course, the lottery is completely random. That works really well, and the way the lottery was set up actually made it work even better. Because if you win $300,000 in the lottery in Massachusetts at the time where we looked, you don't get a check for $300,000, you get a check for $15,000 every year for 20 years. So it's very much like having a universal basic income where you guarantee these people a check every year, irrespective of whether they work or how much they work. And so when we looked at that, we found that it did make some difference. People ended up working a little less if they were already making a fair amount of money, or sometimes they retired a little earlier. But it didn't really have much of an effect. And very interestingly, people who were not working before actually ended up working a little bit more. So it may have helped them kind of get their feet under them, have the ability, have the space to explore new opportunities. And so it actually helped them do better in the labor market later than they would have done otherwise. And so that's the kind of example where you can exploit the fact that someone else is doing the experiment for you. And of course, it would have been an incredibly expensive experiment for us to do. It would have costed on the order of $140 million. And obviously, that was not in my research budget, not then and not even now. And so, but there, the lottery was doing this for us automatically. And so collecting these data allowed us to help the policymakers really figure out what the effects would be of a universal basic income in a way that they couldn't really do before.
And if you look at how professors have applied this method when it comes to analyzing and studying people's behavior to economy, we as government employees, we can somehow apply it in every single sector. because most of these government entities have access to open data, like traffic behaviors, market behaviors, consumer behaviors, and even users' behaviors when it comes to digital platforms and so on. If we apply this method to look at the data and then the impact it had on their daily life, their daily lifestyle, on their behavior, we have a huge treasure to explore. And I wanted to know a bit more about your work with commercial companies, with governments. I heard that you had a project with Amazon.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thanks for that question. It's sort of clear that nowadays we have so many data that we can look at a lot more questions and social problems than we did before. If you go back if you actually go back a long time, one of the earliest examples of one of these natural experiments is really the work by John Snow, who was looking at the cholera epidemic in London in the 1850s. And he kind of painstakingly collected all these data on exactly where the cholera cases occurred. And that allowed him to figure out that it was really contaminated water that was causing the cholera epidemic. He found that it was one particular neighborhood had a lot of cholera cases, and they were using a public water pump on Broad Street that was drawing its water from very downstream in the Thames, where the water was very contaminated with human waste. Now, he had to do that all by hand. But nowadays, of course, we have so much data available, both the public use data, both the administrative data from the governments, as well as data in these private companies, that we can work on many of these problems much more effectively and try to figure out where some of the problems are and what some of the patterns are. And so we can do the kind of things that John Snow did in the cholera epidemic and see where there are problems in society and how we can improve the outcomes there.
Professor, for the past few weeks, I have met some investors, entrepreneurs, and researchers. And there are some people who are a bit worried about the global changes in economics and how economies are shaping worldwide and how global crises are affecting and impacting our societies. Some are worried about their investments, some are worried about the inflation, some are worried about their factories, their wages. From your point of view, how do you diagnose today's global economy and what are the upcoming risks to look for?
Yeah, these are, of course, very difficult questions. I think we've seen in the last couple of years that global supply chains have just become so complex and so intricate that small changes can very easily disrupt things. We saw that when the ship got stuck in the Suez Canal and that it reverberated around the world. And we've seen that during the pandemic where car manufacturers couldn't get all the supplies they needed, and again things reverberated around the whole world. And now with the war in Ukraine, things are maybe getting even worse there. I think in terms of inflation, I hope that the US will be able to get things under control, and I'm fairly optimistic there. But clearly there's a lot of things happening at the moment where it's very uncertain where the world economy is going.
Professor teaches at Stanford, and he works there on many projects and research by empowering young people and young economists and young researchers. Here at the United Arab Emirates, we as a Federal Youth Authority have launched a Young Economist program to build and empower and build the capabilities of 50 young economists every year. Some are now getting trained at the IMF, some are working on banks, some are working in the stock market, some are working as analysts. What would be your advice to young people who wants to be Professor Hidro one day and who wants to win the Nobel Prize in economics one day?
Well, that's of course a very tricky thing. I said, but let me share with you a story. When I was in high school, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do in college. I wasn't quite sure whether I wanted to study mathematics or chemistry, which were two of my favorite subjects. But my economics teacher gave me a book by a Dutch econometrician, Tinbergen, who had actually won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1969. And that book, which had a mixture of mathematics and kind of technical sophistication, but which also had a lot of policy relevance, because Tinbergen had been very involved in Dutch economic policy. That really inspired me. And it's inspired me to go study econometrics in a program Tinbergen had set up in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. And that led me down the path I took then, and I kept studying econometrics for ever since. I didn't really have any thoughts or any ambitions at that time to become a professor. I was interested in the topics. I thought I would end up working for the government because I was interested in doing government policy. But the academic side of the work just kept becoming more and more interesting to me, and I ended up making that my career. And so what I think is really important is to have role models to kind of see that there is a path possible for becoming a professor, for becoming involved in government policy, and for doing better, improving things in society.
I think, Professor, you'll have some tips on what time does the Nobel Prize organization call the winner, because you have missed one call and you got the second call, I think, 2 a.m.
Yeah, so that was a very memorable day, of course, for me. The way things work there is you get actually no warning whatsoever. It's just when they have their meeting in the morning in Stockholm. So living in California, that's 9 hours later. They then called me at 2 in the morning, and as you mentioned, I missed the first call, but luckily I did get the second call, and then after that things very quickly got out of control, where Stanford sent some people around to take some pictures, to help with the media, to take some videos. You mentioned the video with the kids, which was really one of the highlights of that day or of the whole year for me. But they had the kids interview me about my work and ask me what it was all about. And so that was just an amazing experience, really, to do that and kind of see, have that all happen to you. But it did come as a big surprise. Often it happens very late in people's careers, so I was very incredibly fortunate to have it happen at this stage when all three of my kids were still at home and able to share that with me.
And I'm sure that came as a reward to years of hard work. And in our region, we have many of these hard workers, ambitious, young Arabs who believe that one day they may get that call, or they may get these kind of awards for what they have done, and it's possible. I think what we have learned from the United Arab Emirates, a lesson learned for every single person who lives at this land, that impossible is possible. And there are hundreds of ways to make it possible here at the United Arab Emirates. Professor, we sit at the middle of a book fair, and would love to hear about your book recommendations. If you have some recommendations to share, some books to look at or to buy.
So when I was in high school and learning English, I was a big fan of two writers. Ernest Hemingway was a favorite of mine, as well as V.S. Naipaul, who wrote extensively about the travel and novels set in Africa and India. And so those were writers I greatly admire. I've not had the time yet to read the the books of the latest Nobel laureate in literature, but I hope to do so before I go there in December to Stockholm, where I hope to have a chance to actually meet him.
Before I open the floor to the audience to have some, do you have a presentation to share? Or did you cover it mostly?
Yeah, I covered a lot of the things.
بشكل مختصر الله يحفظكم، نشكركم مرة ثانية على حضوركم. إذا حد من الحضور عنده سؤال للبروفيسور، نحن نعتقد جزء كبير من العلوم اللي تطرق لها والعمل اللي بذله خلال السنوات اللي مضت يتناسب مع طبيعة مجتمعاتنا وفهم سلوكيات أفراد هذا المجتمع، سواء من خلال البحث العلمي أو من خلال السلوكيات اليومية بما يتعلق بالاقتصاد والمستهلك بشكل عام، وبما يتعلق بالحكومات ودورها في وضع السياسات الاقتصادية. فإذا حد حاب يسأل أي سؤال it could be in Arabic or English and I'll translate for sure.
Thank you for the very interesting discussion and explaining. I love the thing about the rooster crowing in the morning and then the sunrises. I always thought that was true, so I won't now. The thing I wanted to ask was, what about causality in identical twins?
So the question is about causality in twins. And so people have studied twins in many cases to look at causal effects, to try to distinguish between nature and nurture. Because clearly, if we just compare children having more education with children having less education, we're worried that that's reflecting choices and differences between the children that would have shown up in their outcomes, in their earnings, irrespective of how much education they're getting. And there's a lot of evidence of that. And so there's a lot of evidence that the children, that people who get more education would have had better jobs, would have had higher earnings, even if they'd not had more education. So separating those two out is very important for a lot of government policies, for whether we should encourage more education. And so one of the things people have tried to do is to look at siblings and in particular look at twins. There's actually one of my co-authors, Alan Kruger, at some point collected data by going to a twins festival in the United States. There's a festival every year in a place called Twinsburg, Pennsylvania, where they encourage twins to go and celebrate their being twins. And so what they did there is they interviewed, they surveyed a lot of the people there, and they looked at twins who obviously all grew up in the same families, who had very similar experiences, but then some of them still got very different levels of education. And they used that to tease apart the correlation and causation there and try to figure out what the causal effect of education was. And they came up with very plausible estimates that way. And so that was one of these very clever natural experiment type strategies where you try to get rid of the spurious correlation and get directly at the causal effects. And so what they found was that education did really help. If you look at these twins, where one twin goes to college and the other one doesn't, the twin who does go to college is likely to end up having a better job and earning more than the twin who had exactly the same genetic composition but didn't go to college.
Thank you.
Excuse me if this is a little bit personal question. History of Nobel Prize, most of those who's taking Nobel, their age between 80 and 85. So when I look at you, you are a young man, about 45 maximum. So will you please tell me what's the circumstances make you to be youngest man taking Nobel Prize?
Well, thank you for that question. So really that may be more of a question for the Nobel Prize Committee than for me. I don't know exactly what went into that decision. I shared a prize with two good friends of mine, Joshua Angrist, who was actually the best man at my wedding and a long-time collaborator. We started working together when we were both junior faculty at Harvard University, and we were living in university housing that didn't actually have, and we didn't have washing machines and dryers in our apartment, so we would spend the Saturday in the laundromat doing our laundry together, and we started working there on these problems that eventually we got awarded the Nobel Prize for. But so I shared it with Josh Angrist and David Carter, who's also a very good friend of mine, and they are a little older than me, 5-6 years. But so I think I just got very lucky there in working early on with them.
حسناء الجريس صحفية من الأهرام العربي. حسناء الجريس صحفية من الأهرام العربي. طبعا احنا سعداء بوجود حضرتك معانا النهارده وتشرفنا بحضرتك جدا. فرصة سعيدة ان معرض أبو ظبي الدولي للكتاب أتاح لنا الفرصة ان احنا نقابل حضرتك ونتعرف على حضرتك ونتعرف على منجزك في عالم الاقتصاد. دلوقتي أنا عندي سؤال مهم جدا أعرفه من حضرتك. من عام 2007 والعالم كله بيعاني من أزمة اقتصادية، ووقتها طلع الرئيس الفرنسي فرانسوا اولاند وقتها وقال إن إحنا ممكن نعالج الأزمة دي في فرنسا بالثقافة والفكر. دلوقتي من عام 2007 لحد دلوقتي كل يوم بيواجه العالم أزمات، أزمة كورونا، جائحة كورونا، التغيرات المناخية اللي العالم دلوقتي بيشهدها، وكل ده بيأثر على اقتصاد العالم. طبعا الأزمة بتتفاقم، ورغم تزايد معدلات استخدام التكنولوجيا اللي بيحصل نوع من التناقض في العالم في هذا الإطار. يعني كيف نخرج أو كيف يخرج العالم من هذا المأزق؟ رؤية حضرتك في هذا الإطار.
Thank you for the question. That's of course a very complicated set of questions, and I think the big challenge is that we need to find ways of cooperating better than we've done in parts of the pandemic and in parts of the climate, the challenges with climate. And I don't quite know why it has been so much more difficult this time in the pandemic to come to agreements on how to deal with the challenges. When I was a child in the Netherlands in the early 70s, there was also concern about vaccines for polio, but in those days in Dutch society we were able to come together and figure out how to make sure that everybody came together and in the fight against polio. And it seems to have become a much bigger challenge these days with COVID. But I think we somehow have to find a way of dealing with these problems together, because these are too big for any one country or for any one person to deal with. And in particular, climate change, because it's the defining problem of our generation, and we need to deal with that together.
Yes, here, sorry, in English I will ask, when we talk about data, it's more about quantitative data than qualitative data. So it's numbers, more dry kind of inputs that you look at. How did you include the qualitative inputs, the emotional part, in your Nobel Prize winning?
So the question is about whether we also take into account qualitative aspects of of people's behavior and preferences. And so when we did the survey, when we surveyed the people who'd won the lottery, when we looked at the effects of universal basic income, we also asked a lot of questions that were less quantitative. We asked people about how much they were working, how many hours they were working, what their earnings were. But we also asked them about their general life situation, how happy they were. And so we still ended up quantifying, sort of transforming them into numbers so that we could use them for analysis. But we tried to get the whole picture of how winning the lottery affected people's lives, because clearly that's a very important thing, and it's not just about the earnings part of what was happening to these people after winning the lottery.
حجيبة ماء العينين المصدر ميديا من المغرب. فقط أريد بالنسبة لمسألة جائحة كورونا، كثرة الإشاعات بشكل كبير، وفي إشاعات اللي هي طبعا كثير غير صحيحة، وظهرت نظرية المؤامرة سواء بالنسبة للأشخاص سواء بالنسبة للدول. إلى أي حد ممكن الإشاعة أو نظرية المؤامرة اللي هي بتحضر دائما خصوصا فيما يتعلق بجائحة كورونا، إلى أي حد تؤثر على الاقتصاد العالمي؟ شكرا.
Yeah, I think that's a big challenge, and I don't quite know why it has become so much harder to listen to the experts in areas like Corona and in measures for dealing with the pandemic. But somehow there's so many more conspiracy theories floating around on the internet that it's become very hard to convince people of what the consensus is in the scientific community. And that creates big problems for countries. It creates big problems for the whole world. And we have to find ways of getting the message out more consistently and more clearly.
أنا دعاء عبد الرحمن من التلفزيون المصري. دعاء عبد الرحمن التلفزيون المصري. أنا عايز أسأل حضرتك سؤال، هل الاقتصاد العالمي الحالي نتيجة للنظام العالمي الجديد أم أن الاقتصاد هو ما يوجه النظام العالمي الجديد؟
So there, I don't really know whether there's a global economic order that controls the economy. I don't think there is. I think there is a world economy, and that constrains what governments can do. Because governments don't have unlimited power these days. They're affected by what's happening in the rest of the world, and so that constrains some of what they can do.
Hello. Thank you very much, Professor, for this interesting and eye-opening session. I'm doing my PhD in data science and AI. And my question is about transferability of data and knowledge when it comes to having or using this like knowledge or experimental results from one community or one culture to the other culture. What are maybe factors that we need to consider, and if there is like a good example in which this has happened and benefited research? Thank you.
Well, congratulations on doing a PhD in data science. I think that's an incredibly important field nowadays, and it's only going to get more important as we get more and more data. And so the challenge you bring up, presumably the challenge you're studying, about how you take results from one area, from one community to another, is a really important one. And so, of course, in medicine, even in medicine, like in drug trials, that can be a problem. But there, we often think that what we try out on one community or for one set of individuals will probably still work for another set of individuals. If it's just something like aspirin, if it works in dealing with headaches for people in Belgium, then it probably also works for people in the United States or in Argentina or anywhere else. Because the physiology is actually the same. But for social programs, they can be very different. If we find that more education helps, early childhood intervention programs help in England, they may not help in the US because they may be quite different there. And so we need to, in order to be able to take the results from one community to another community, we have to study both what the differences are in the communities, and we have to study what the content is of the programs and break them down into components that have the same effect in different communities. And we have to figure out really what makes them different in one community from the other. And that's in fact what you see in a lot of the economic experiments that are being done these days, that they try them out in a number of different communities to make sure that they understand where the variation between the communities is coming from. But that's something where there's still much more work that needs to be done in order to be confident that the results we use really are useful for policymakers in informing their policy decisions.
I wanted to go back to the pandemic, and it has obviously affected the world, education, economics, even social habits of humans. Do you feel that the data that is coming out of these 3 years now of COVID are usable data, are data that you can use for research? Are research analysts thinking that they've won the lottery with the available data that's been handed over to them?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it has been an enormous shock to the educational system. And I think especially for early childhood education, it has been incredibly challenging. But at the same time, it has taught us an enormous amount. And it's sort of clear that in the future, we're going to have more online education, and we're going to learn much more about what are effective ways of doing that. Even before the pandemic, there were already a number of universities, a number of companies that were trying to figure out how to make online education work. But it still wasn't really particularly good. And I think now, over the last 2 years, we've accumulated so much experience with it. We've seen what things actually work. We've seen what things don't work. And we're now in a much better place to actually build programs that are going to work, that are going to scale, and that are going to help children in all different places and from all different ages. So from that perspective, I think there's going to be an incredibly valuable experiences coming out of the pandemic that are going to enormously improve what we do in schools, what we do in universities, where really for a very long time we've been doing exactly the same as what we've always been doing. And this has forced us to experiment in a way that is going to have payoffs for a long time to come.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I have two questions. One is, I mean, what we call credibility revolution, or the causality, the improvement in causality. In my understanding, it has worked very well in microeconomics, micro studies, compared to macro studies. Why is that? And the second is your recent work with your partner is in machine learning. So how do you see, or how do you perceive machine learning, and what will bring to economics in general and to empirical work? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for those two questions. So about the first part, that in macroeconomics, it clearly is much more challenging. It's even more challenging than in microeconomics to tease apart cause and effect. And so that's always been the case, and I think there's still much more work to be done. But there are parts of macroeconomics where we can now also use these methods. For example, traditionally, when researchers looked at the effect of monetary policy at central bank changes, they would use very traditional methods that would essentially look at the correlation between interest rates and outcomes. But it's been some work that exploited very cleverly the fact that sometimes the Federal Reserve doesn't really have decisions to make because everybody knows they're going to be changing interest rates. And other times, it's not really clear what they're going to do. And when they go into the meeting, it's really a coin toss whether they're going to increase interest rates or leave them the same. And those are really very valuable experiences to figure out what the effect of what the Federal Reserve is doing on the economy. And so, even though to summarize that, even though it's harder in macroeconomics, it is still possible to find places where you can really clearly and convincingly find causal effects. For the second question about machine learning and data science in general, the computer science work on machine learning has really created a whole set of new methods that are going to be incredibly useful in economics and all other social sciences. And so it's only those methods have only just begun being used there, but they're really going to change the way we do econometrics, the way we do economics, and it's going to give us the opportunity to exploit much more of all the data that is available nowadays, both the administrative data, the data that some of these companies collect, and of course there's lots of privacy issues there, but if we can find some ways of harnessing the information in that data, we're going to be able to improve social policies and government policies immensely, because these data are just so incredible, these methods are so incredibly powerful for exploiting that information.
Professor, before ending this session, we have a saying here, is when you look at great men, look at great women around them. And for your family who would be watching this session today, what's your message to your wife, to your kids, here from the United Arab Emirates?
Well, as the last questioner mentioned, I've actually done a lot of work with my wife, who was a very distinguished economist in her own right. And so I've just been incredibly grateful for the opportunity to work with her, because it's created incredibly interesting questions and challenges, and it's really pushed my work forward. And for my children, I just hope that they find things they're passionate about, and that they're going to investigate and learn and help improve the policies and help improve the world.
Thank you, Professor. We are grateful for Abu Dhabi Book Fair for hosting Professor Jeido. I think today we have lots of content and terminologies and research to digest, and I hope this opens our minds and curiosity to dig deeper into what's possible when it comes to data science and when it comes to analyzing different patterns of economy and different aspects of our relations to economics. Thank you for joining. شكرا لكم. نتشرف بكم وسامحونا على الإطالة، لكن الحديث حول موضوع البيانات وعلم البيانات وأثره على الاقتصاد شيق ومؤثر. أنا فخور أن هناك بين شابات وشباب من المختصين في علم البيانات والمهندسين في مجال البيانات. هناك طالبة معنا اليوم تدرس الدكتوراه في علم البيانات، وهناك لدينا اقتصاديين شباب ولدينا مختصين في مجالات مختلفة في الاقتصاد. كل ثقة أن السنوات القادمة بتقدم لنا مفكرين وقادة فكر في الاقتصاد من هذه المنطقة. من أمثال البروفيسور اللي نحن نفخر بكل ما عمل عليه من أبحاث، ونتأمل أن نشوف شبابنا منافسين ورواد في هذا المجال. فشكرا لكم وشكرا للمنظمين وشكرا لكل من عمل على هذا الملتقى الجميل. نتمنى لكم التوفيق. Thank you. Thank you, Professor.